Hi, my name is Daria, and I'm a colorist, compositor, and a DaVinci Resolve master trainer. Today, I'll be taking you through the workflows and operations of the color page in DaVinci Resolve. Now, at first glance, the color page might look quite busy, but it's much easier to approach when you think of it as a collection of panels, each with its own dedicated function. So let's take a look at this layout. In the top left corner, we have the gallery. This is where you're going to be storing all of your stills. Stills are high-quality grabs of a frame from any one of your clips, but they're also capable of containing all of the grading data from those clips. So they're going to be quite important for sharing grades and also for copying across your timeline. In the top center, you have the viewer. This represents the location of your playhead at any time. And it also gives you the final look of any clip. So this is essentially what's going to be rendered out in the deliver page. The viewer has a lot of usability. We will be referring to the controls in the bottom left-hand corner. With these, you can activate the on-screen controls, and they will usually also automatically light up, depending on which panel you have active. In the top right corner, you have the node editor. So this is arguably the bit in the page where you have the most control. You're able to break up your workflow into separate little nodes, each with its own dedicated approach to the RGB signal. Underneath the viewer, you have two different representations of the timeline. You have the thumbnails timeline, in which you can see a grab of all of your clips. And it's completely independent of the duration of these clips. So this is just to give you a visual overview of what everything looks like. Underneath that, you have the timeline ruler, which is more representative of the timeline that you have on the edit page. So here you can check out the durations of the clips in relation to each other. Also see things like transitions. You can see multiple video tracks. If you're performing visual effects compositing, that's going to be quite vital. You'll refer to that when you need to. At the bottom of the page, you have a collection of palettes. So these are divided into three columns. You've got the left palettes, the central palettes, and then on the right-hand side, you've got your keyframes and your scopes, which you'll be referring to quite a lot. There's also a lot of other functionality in the page that's not immediately visible. So for example, at the top, you've got the interface toolbar. And here you have buttons with which you can either reveal or hide panels based on what it is that you're trying to do. So if, for example, I wanted to start applying LUTs or lookup tables to my media to remap it to a certain color standard, I would open them up at the top here, then refer to the media pool if I need to, and go back to the gallery if I had to. Another reason to take advantage of these buttons is that the way that the interface behaves is dynamically, which means that whatever space you afford any of the panels, they will take advantage of it. So sometimes I really want to see my viewer more prominently than it is right now. Usually the first thing I'll do is collapse my timeline ruler, the top, and as you just saw, the viewer popped up dynamically, so that's really great. And I can keep going with this. I can also collapse my clips timeline and either collapse the gallery or even just grab the edge and extend it. So there is a certain level of customization on this page. I'll bring my clips back so I can keep working on them. Something else that a lot of the panels have are options menus. So these are represented by this button with the three dots. And when you select these usually give you access to additional controls or tools that are embedded in all of these panels. So you can see the viewer's got one, and the node editor, etc. Something else that some of the panels have is pop-down menus that give you access to additional modes of any given palette. So that's quite interesting because that means that we have the curves palette, but inside of that we actually have 5 additional HSL curves. So I can access these by using the drop-down menu here. Or what I prefer to do is actually use the palette controls at the very top. So these are represented with these dots. And as long as you know where something is located, you can jump to it pretty quickly. You can also find it on the color wheels. So this is usually how I switch between my primaries wheels, my bars, and my log controls. Finally, you've also got the contextual menu. This pops up anytime you right-click within the color page. But what's unique about it is that it's never the same in two locations. So it is unique to whatever element you're clicking on, whether it's a clip or whether it's a palette. So it will never give you controls that you can't actively take advantage of. All right, so let's start looking at our media and performing some grading. First thing I'd like to do is address some of our primary grading tools. So primary grading is any grading you perform that affects the entire frame of the image. This can be done at the earliest stages of grading, so whether you're doing color correction or you're doing normalization and balancing. So with all of those, it implies that you are calibrating the entire frame. But this is also done at the latter stages of the process when you're creating looks and you're performing creative grading, so that's also primary. And we perform all of these changes usually using the color wheels or the curves palettes. Those are our main approaches. So we'll use both today, and they will oftentimes achieve similar things just in different ways. I'm going to make sure my first clip on the timeline is selected so that I can see it in the viewer. And I'm going to make sure that looping is enabled underneath my viewer so that when I play it back, I just keep watching it on loop. Going to press spacebar. And something that is probably very evident about this clip right away is that it's really flat. So there's no colors in it, and the tonal range is just not very dynamic, so I'm not seeing much contrast. I don't have a very clear idea of what the black point and the white point are. So our job right now with normalization is to try to extend that luminance range so that we can get a greater breadth of shadows and highlights. To do that, I am going to need to refer to my scopes. So like I said earlier, they're hiding in the same panel as my keyframes. I'm going to zoom in here and click on the scopes button next to it. Now by default, you're going to see the parades, which are absolutely fantastic for balancing because you can see the relationship between the red, green, and blue channels. But in this case, if we're just adjusting luminance, then I would prefer to use the drop-down menu to open up the waveform. And by default, it's overlaying the red, green, and blue channels, which is also useful for balancing because you can then see where they line up and where something might be too high or too low. But if I want to just see the luminance, I can access the settings of my waveform scopes. And I get this little pop-up interface. I think it's quite handy because it allows you to switch from RGB to YRGB at the top, so now we've got just a luminance waveform. But then we've also got additional controls at the bottom. You've got brightness controls on the trace inside the graph, so I can click and drag the scroller. And this can be extremely useful because sometimes the elements that you need to see might be quite faint on the trace. They might be very small, or they might just be specular points, so highlights in the image. And by brightening it up, you make them pop a little bit more. To get rid of this settings window, all I have to do is just click outside of it and it pops back into the palette. And now I can start making adjustments to my clip. Like I said, the first adjustments will be made using the color wheels palette. So let's check it out. Let's identify what everything is doing over here. As you can see, we've got 4 wheels. We've got the lift, gamma, and gain, which are responsible for the shadows, midtones, and highlights respectively. And then on the far right, we've got the offset wheel, which is just a combination of all 3. So it will perform a uniform change to the entire image. On the wheels themselves, you're able to change the colors of the image. So I'm just going to grab the pointer in the middle of the offset wheel and just drag it towards one of the colors just to test it out. And you can see the entire image just went magenta. We can shovel it around so you can see I'm increasing saturation the further I push it. If I want to reset the color wheel, I will double click inside of it and the pointer will just pop down to the center. Now another way to control these tonal ranges is to go after the master wheels underneath the color wheels. So these are the dark horizontal sliders, and they are also responsible for all of these respective tonal ranges. but this time only affecting the luminance of the image. So on the left-hand side, for example, I have the master wheel for lift, which means that I can either make my shadows darker or I can make those shadows lighter. So if I was to grab it right now and drag it to the left, you can see it's darkening. And it is impacting the rest of the image as well, so it's not a very strict tonal range. It does spill off and affect the midtones a fair amount, and even the highlights a little bit. And that just makes for a very organic application of the luminance change. If I want to reset the master wheels and the color wheels together, I can use the bigger reset button next to the tonal range name. And then there is also a universal reset button in the top right corner of the color wheels palette. So you're going to see these in a few of the other palettes if you ever want to make a more blanket reset. So how will I make this adjustment based on the scope's information that I have? You can probably tell that the trace is quite crunched up. It's quite compressed in the bottom half of the scope's graph that I have. And that's usually indicative of a very flat image, so not much variety. Also, because it's in the lower half, it tells me that it's a dark image. So what I'm going to do is try to spread that out a bit and also to raise the brightness. I will begin with the lift and the shadows, and they're already in a fairly good place, but I tend to bring them down a bit lower, so I try to pop it down between the black point and the first horizontal line above it. Remember, the idea here is not to set up nice contrast. It's not to make a look. It's just to normalize this trace so that later on when we do start applying creative looks, we have access, to the full range of that RGB signal. So we're just cleaning this up right now. I definitely don't want to go anywhere near the 0 point, which is our black point, because as soon as the trace starts touching that line, it's going to start clipping our data, and we will essentially be looking at a pool of black in the image, and that's just no good for later stages. So I am going to very gently drag that master wheel to the left, and that's just about where I would drop it off. It's a very small adjustment. I can then do the same thing for the opposite end, for the gain. I can click it, and this time I'm not dragging left because I'm going to be darkening it. I'm dragging to the right to spread it out. And normally, if I am just setting up a tonal range, I'm just normalizing, I would drag it all the way to just under the second horizontal line, because that way it brightens up the image, but without bringing it anywhere near, overexposing it. But something that matters a lot when you're color grading is context. So you also have to keep an eye on the image and ask yourself, do I have enough relevant information to perform this adjustment? So if I had something like a clapperboard visible in the shot, or if somebody was holding up a white piece of paper, then I could say objectively, yes, I've got my light source, it's hitting the white piece of paper, so I can drag the top of that trace to that horizontal line. But in our case, we have some B-roll from a documentary. They were not using color checkers, so I kind of have to guess as to what is pure white in this image, and there's not a clear reference. However, I do see something that can be used as a reference for luminance, and that is this person's hand that you can just see through these wooden poles in the image, right? So knowing what I know about calibrating skin tones, I know that with a fair skin tone in direct sunlight, I can probably aim between 50 to 75% of the height of the scopes. So in this case, what's happening is I'm actually really overexposing the image based on this trace, which is that hand that we're seeing. So you can even see it in the viewer as well. So if you look at the full screen of the image right now, and the thumb is quite hot. So I'm going to grab the gain master wheel and pull it back and drop it off at around 75% of the height. And now it looks much more natural, and I've kept the colors and the luminance safe. You'll also have noticed that the bottom of the trace is pulled up when I readjusted the gain, so that's completely natural. This happens. Grading is very much a reiterative process. It means that you often have to go back to the tools that you used previously and make further adjustments because the tools offset each other a little bit, and that's fine. So I can go back to the lift and just drop it down a little bit more. And then maybe the last thing I want to do with this image, because it is particularly dark, is just brighten up the gamma range, which is essentially the midtones. Right now, most of the trace is falling beneath the 50% line, so I'm going to try to get it a bit closer to the 50 dotted line. I'll click the gamma master wheel, pull it to the right, and you can see I'm brightening up the entire image. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this adjustment. The next thing I'd like to address is the lack of saturation. So it almost looks monochromatic right now. To do that, I will continue using the color wheels palette, but this time I'm going to look at the very bottom of it, at this bar called the adjustment controls. So here you can make some standard adjustments to your image, things like contrast, saturation, hue rotation. And you've also got a second page of adjustment controls, which we'll be looking at later, but it gives you temperature and tint adjustments, which are really nice, really quick ways of balancing your image. So in this case, I'll go back to page 1. To make changes, by the way, to any of these values, you can either click and drag with your mouse. So you can notice that when I hover over either the name of the adjustment or the numerical field next to it, you've got these double arrows pointing in either direction, which encourages you to drag. So I can click on the contrast, for example, drag left to decrease, drag right to increase. To reset any of the values, all you have to do is double-click the field name. So to reset the contrast, I'm just going to double-click, and it jumps back to 0 or to 1. In this case, I'd like to increase the saturation, and the way I'm going to do it is by clicking on the numerical field and just entering the value if I know what it is using my number pad. Press enter, and that's just popped up the saturation a bit. I know that for something in a log gamut, 75% is pretty decent, but if I do want to saturate it further, I'll probably have a dedicated saturation node for it. All right, so image has been shifted. Something that the saturation has revealed in this particular image is that it does have a really strong color cast that wasn't immediately obvious to me before. So it's almost got like a reddish or pinkish tinge to it. So let's address that next. I am going to continue using the color wheels, well, the palette at least, but I might not want to use the wheels themselves for this, right? So I find that the wheels are quite fun to work with when I'm applying a creative look to the image, because it almost feels like playing around with paint. You're pushing colors in one direction, you're dragging them away in another. But when it comes to exact calibration, they're a little bit trickier to work with. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to switch from the primaries wheels to the primaries bars. All right, so these are also known as printer lights, and they affect the image in exactly the same way as the wheels. In fact, if you look down here at the numbers under the master wheels, you can see that the values that we had established on the color in the primaries wheels section of the palette have stayed in place. So this is just an alternative way of adjusting the colors, but much more exact. If I want to make a change, I could just grab any one of these bars and drag upwards or downwards to adjust the strength of the value. I'm going to press Command Z to undo that. I also like to use the scroll wheel on the mouse when I'm making adjustments with these, because I find that the changes happen in much smaller increments, which means that you can be very, very precise. You can go down in 0.1 or 0.01. All right, but how much should I be adjusting this and where? We could use the parades for this, and we will later on, but I want to show you a different technique, which is really simple and really helpful, and that's using an overlay inside the viewer itself. So I'm going to right-click to bring up the contextual menu, and I have this option to show the picker RGB value. What that means is that when I select this, everywhere that I move my mouse in the viewer, I will get a readout of the pixel directly underneath it. And If I had reliable white and black references, I could hover over them and identify if I had a color dominance in any of them. Like I said previously, I don't have that in this image. However, when we refer to context, we have a rhinoceros, and I have every reason to believe that his skin tone would be grayscale. I don't really think there would be a really strong lean towards any one color. But when I hover over him with my mouse, I find that there's a variation of about 15 to 20 points on the red channel that are higher than on the green and the blue. So that implies to me that we definitely have too much red. And based on these numbers, I'm also seeing that they're in the higher range of the trace. So if this was closer to, 10, 20, 50, that would imply more of a shadow area. So then I would go for a lower range in the primaries bars. But in this case, I think going after gain would make the most sense. So I'm just going after the brighter areas of the image. I think the shadows actually look pretty neutral from where I'm sitting. So I'm just going to hover my mouse over the red bar on the gain and very gently just scroll my mouse wheel. Actually, it's doing it in reverse because I'm on a Mac. So I'm scrolling upwards. And you can see that red tint is starting to disappear a little bit. Before I go too far, I can go back with my mouse, and I'll see that the numbers are getting much closer. So now it's a variation of maybe less than 10. So I might even take it up just one more scroll, just one more flick, and come back. And I'm perfectly happy with this. Now it's just a couple of points, and it'll vary a little bit as I move around. So I'm pretty happy with that. I will want to compare this to my original image before I move on. I think that's a really good way to ground yourself in reality, because sometimes when you disable the grade and you look at the original image, you realize how far you've strayed. So to do this, I can either click on the number of the node that I'm working on. So that would be number 1. And that bypasses it temporarily, and I can see that's the original image. And yeah, definitely, we've brightened it up. We can see much nicer colors now, and there's no color dominance. Something else I might prefer to do is just to use a shortcut. So that would be Command-D on a Mac or Control-D on a PC. And I would just have my fingers over Command-D pretty much all day long, bypassing as I'm grading. Oh, scrolled up too far, so I'm going to hit Shift-Z to pop back in. Cool. So now that the image has been cleaned up, it's been normalized and balanced, we're ready to start applying creative looks to it, knowing that we have full access to the entire RGB range, so at its full extension. And what I'd like to do is to create a new node for that. It's an organizational step, of course, so that you've got one node for balancing, one node for color grading, but it's actually more important than that. Breaking up the workflow into 2 steps means that I'm now taking advantage of this extended signal. If I was to start applying a creative look on the same node that I balanced on, it wouldn't really make sense, because I would actually be grading that version of the trace, the compressed one. So I want to move past that. I want to open up a fresh node and now work on this version of the trace. To create a new node, I am going to right-click on node number 1, and in the contextual menu, select Add Node and Add Serial. And this will just add a standard corrector node connected to the one that you already have and allow you to apply more grading. Notice that the new node that I've created is pretty blank, so there's nothing visible on it, whereas on the left-hand side on node number 1, I can see a little symbol. So this is one way that we know that a node's already been used for grading. Another way is when you hover over it, you will also see a list pop up telling you which tools specifically you've used. This is super helpful because it allows you to keep track of what you used, which node you used for what, and make sure you're not duplicating your processes. Something else that you can do for organizational reasons is to start labeling your nodes. So I'm very, very big on housekeeping. I organize everything. I make folders and bins, and I label absolutely everything. So I'm going to right-click on node number 1, I'm going to select node label from the contextual menu, and I'm going to enter balance because that's what I was doing on that first node. And now the clean signal is being sent out to node number 2, and I'm going to change that to look, because that's where I'll be creating my creative look. Cool. So for that, what I think would be nice to do is just to push a certain color dominance into it. Like I said earlier, for that, the color wheels are absolutely fantastic. They're really intuitive. If you were using a panel, which I'll be getting out in a second, you can use the balls to just rotate them and get a feel for what works well with that image. Of course, you'd also talk to the director about the context of the scene, what mood they're going for, or does a certain location have a certain color code? But in this case, I'm just going to switch from the bars back to the wheels. And a really easy way to establish dominance, as you saw at the very beginning, was using the offset wheel, and you just push it in one direction and you've got a color. However, I'd prefer to use the gamma wheel for this because it will create a similar result, just without affecting the white point and the black point of the image. And those two are quite nice to keep neutral, because then it keeps an element of realism to the scene, even with a strong color cast. So I'm going to drag this pointer in the gamma towards a cyan look, just a greeny blue. And I can be pretty aggressive with it because I'm just setting it up. But because of how large the gamma tonal range is, it will inevitably impact the shadows and the highlights. So what I also like to do is then go to either the lift or the gamma, the gain wheel, and counteract the grade that I just introduced. So I'm essentially sort of neutralizing one area of the tonal range, and that again grounds it in reality and makes it look a little bit more accessible. Right now it looks too much like a flat filter, I think. So I'll grab the pointer on the lift wheel, drag it towards red, and that's kind of made the shadows a lot more neutral, right? And it might look like the whole shot has now become like balanced again, but let's press Command D and take ourselves back to reality and see what this used to look like. So I'm going to press Command D, and you can see that we have actually added a cyan cast to it and kept the shadows nice and realistic. Something else that I might want to do at this stage is to start working with the luminance, because even though we've rescued our trace, we haven't really made it look very dynamic or very interesting. So I am going to go down here into my adjustment controls, click and drag the contrast, and increase it until I'm happy with it. So I really like what it's doing to the detail on the rhino. It's making that skin pop and those his eyes, his wrinkles. But I think what's also happening is that certain parts of the image are becoming a little overexposed. So sometimes you get that. So you're happy with the contrast, but not with how dark or light the overall image is. And for that, you can use the pivot. So you can find that next to the contrast, and you can think of it as the contrast balance. So it will kind of sway dominance to either the brighter or the darker areas, while still maintaining the same level of contrast. So if I'm happy with the wrinkles as they are, I'm just going to grab the pivot and try to remove some of that like overly exposed areas. All right. So now I think the rhino skin looks much, much nicer than it did before. And maybe lower the contrast just to bring back some of the shadows that I have down here. Something else I might want to do is take advantage of this tool I have called the Midtone Detail. This is found on the second page of the color adjustment controls, and it's labeled as MD. And what MD does is it increases contrast in areas of the image that have a high amount of detail. So it's really great for bringing up patterns or bringing up, in this case, the wrinkles on the rhino without necessarily increasing like the overall contrast of the image. I am going to use the scroll wheel on my mouse to zoom in on the viewer so I can see his skin texture a bit better. And I'm also going to middle click my mouse button to drag across the viewer. Well, I'm going to go back here into the adjustment controls, click on MD, and drag it upwards. And you can see what that's doing to the skin. It's just really popping it out, making it even more dynamic. I'm pretty happy with that, so I'm going to press Shift-Z to pop out of the viewer. And it's a pretty strong look, I know, but this was my intention, so I'll stick by it. Cool. I think, yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. Let's move on to the next clip on the timeline and try to do something similar, but this time using a completely different palette. So this will be our curves. Let's move on to this next clip too. And once again, I'll play it through. It's really important to review the media before you start grading it because I've used this word before, context. Sometimes things move into the shot that you don't see on the first frame. And you might spend, half an hour or even hours working on something and then play it back when you're done and realize, oh my gosh, two people just walked into the scene that I thought was just, a landscape shot. So in this case, it seems to be pretty uniform. It is a really dark image and it's really quite compressed on the scopes. So I'm going to try once again to expand that tonal range, this time using the curves. Let's take a look at the curves interface. You have the primary curve control on the graph over here, and it correlates exactly to the scopes graph that you have on the right-hand side. So the very bottom of the curve represents the black point, the top represents the white point, and when you make adjustments to those, you will then be extending or compressing your trace. So for example, if I wanted to increase my trace right now, I could grab the white point, and when I pull it to the left, I'm pushing it upwards. When I drag it downwards, I'm compressing it downwards. Same thing for the black point. You can also add additional points to the curves by clicking on it. So I can decide to lift the gamma range, and that will be the central point. And as you can see, it's kind of expanding our trace. And I can add additional points depending on what I'm trying to achieve. I can also right-click on any of my points to delete them. And finally, I can use the universal reset arrow in the top right corner to just go back to the default position of the curves. Notice on the right-hand side, you have some individual curve controls for the red, green, and blue values, which is fantastic. I can click on any one of these and start adjusting just the red channel, for example. By dragging it upwards, I'm increasing that value. By dragging it downwards, I am adding the opposite color. So the opposite of red is cyan. You can memorize these color pairs, red, cyan, green, magenta, blue, and yellow. But if you can't remember them, you can always just refer to the color wheels, which just represent those relationships very clearly. So there it is, red and cyan on the opposite side of it. And color grading is performed in much the same way. You introduce colors that you want to see or remove them if you don't. And so is balancing. So you just push back on what you don't need to see. I'm going to reconnect all three of my channels, and I'll use this first node for normalization and balancing. I'll grab the black point and drag it downwards until the trace again falls somewhere between the black point and the first horizontal line from the bottom. And then I'll also drag the white point a fair amount to the left, so I feel like there's a lot of room to raise this image. It's really dark. And unlike the previous one, I think I have a fairly reliable point. I have this window that's open in the background, and I have no reason to believe that it's going to have a cast on it, but I'm going to try to make it as bright as I can without overexposing it. So I'm going to drag it to about the the second horizontal line from the top. So it falls about yay high. And I can still see a little bit of detail through the window, which is quite important, I think. If I try to be a bit more aggressive with this and keep pushing it forward, I'm going to lose some of that detail, and eventually I'm going to start overexposing it, and that's not what you want to do. So I'm going to drag it back down, and I'll press Command-D to compare that to the original, so you can see it's got a really nice extension, a bit more to work with. Also, just like with the previous image, I'm going to raise the gamma range a little bit just to bring that trace a bit higher. I'm not going to go for the mid-range necessarily because I know that this is an interior shot. I don't believe there was any lighting in that room aside from what was coming in through the window, so I can naturally anticipate for it to be naturally dark anyway. I'm going to click on the center of my curve and just drag it up just a little bit to reveal some more details on the face of those scales, but then drop it off when I'm finished, just about there. Now, to balance the image, this time I'm going to use the parades. Before I switch my scopes to the parades, take a look at this trace and maybe try to memorize its pattern a little bit, right? We've got this area on the left-hand side, which is representing the bright window, and then the rest of it is kind of more or less flat in the bottom half. When I click on the parade mode of the scopes, what you're actually seeing is the same exact trace, just tripled. And it's representing the luminance, or the presence of luminance in all three channels, red, green, and blue. If this image was black and white, then these parades would be exactly equal to each other. And if I had reliable white and black references, then those areas of the traces would also line up perfectly, because in something that's pure white, the RGB values should be identical. Same thing for black. If there is naturally colorful objects in the scene, so in this case, for example, I have this red arrow in the middle of the scales. So I would anticipate that in that part of the trace, the red would be a bit more dominant, and that's perfectly fine. But I feel like I am seeing some unnatural dominance, one that I cannot justify by red objects. So if you look at the very top of the red channel trace, it is visibly higher than the green and the blue, so I'm going to need to address that using my curves. And you can also see that the midtones, there's like almost like a hump on the lower midtones that's higher than the green and blue as well. So for this, I'm going to isolate my red channel. And I'm just going to go for the midpoint and hope that the gamma is enough to pull down the top half of this trace as well. So I'll click the point that we've already created. And I'm not even looking at the viewer, by the way. I'm just looking at the parades as I do this. And you know what? I'm pretty happy with this. I've got a pretty good lineup between the red and the green. But now I've also revealed that the blue channel is substantially lower. So I can also address that. I'm going to isolate the blue channel on the curves. Click the pointer, and then drag it upwards to try to get the height closer to where the green and the red are. So it's a very gentle adjustment, but it's getting us there. If I press Command D right now, you can see that we've wiped out that red tint that we had, and also the image has been substantially brightened up. So yeah, that'll be a pleasure to work with once we create another node and we start applying a creative look. Once again, I'm going to label this as my balance. By the way, we've been performing both normalization, which is when you work on the tonal range, and balancing, which is when you work on the colors, in one node. But very often colorists break this up into two steps, and that's perfectly fine. That allows you to expand the luminance of the image as much as you need to, and then use a completely separate node to then work on the colors on a much broader range of the image. So that sometimes just makes it more comfortable, and you might consider doing it that way. In our case, I'm going for the contrast next, so I'm going to right-click on the balance and add a new serial node, which will go right after it. And I will only use this for contrast this time, so I'm just interested in kind of popping out the details and yeah, making the shadows a bit more dramatic. I'll right-click and select contrast. And type in contrast. And since we're using the curves for everything on this clip, we will continue to use them for the contrast. I'm going to bind my RGB channels so that I'm now impacting the entire luminance range of the image. And to adjust the tonal range or to create contrast, I'm going to need to deepen the shadows while brightening up the highlights or the upper midtones, because that's essentially what defines contrast, right? I can do this using the black point and the white point, but the more conventional approach when you're color grading is to add 2 points to the curve itself and drag them in opposite directions. And this tends to produce an S shape. So that's why it's called an S curve when you're applying contrast using these tools. I'm just going to grab the bottom one here, make sure that it's not too dark, but it's just affecting just the parameter of those scales just a little bit. And I'm also going to drag the white point up. But remember, still keeping an eye on the trace, because I was really particular about not overexposing that window. I still want to keep it like in a reasonable range. But just a little bit. And if I feel like I still want to add more contrast to bring up the details on the scales, but I'm starting to see a bit of crushing on the edges, like of some other information, again, I'm going to switch to the adjustment controls on the color wheels and just push up my mid-tone detail. Just a little bit. There we go. And I'll press Command D, and you can see in the full image, even though the colors have remained unchanged, we now have a much more dynamic looking image. Now, if I wanted to start color grading the image, still using the curves, I might not want to do it on the same node. First of all, we've already used our curves palette, so there's already points in it, and if I start playing around with that, I'm kind of working on the previous version of the trace that we had. And on top of that, I don't really want to interfere with the contrast that I've created. I'm really happy with it. So I'm going to create a dedicated look node. Now the question is, where do I want to place it on this pipeline? I'm going to discuss the importance of node structure and pipelines later on. But in this case, I'm motivated to put the look before my contrast, because I find that I'm always happy to see like what it does to the shadows at the very end. Whereas if I put the contrast in too early, then it tends to be a little bit more destructive to the final look. So I might end up kind of creating flat pools of luminance in certain parts of the image. So to add a node before one that I have selected, I will go into my contextual menu, and this time I'm going to select Add Serial Before. So it's the same corrector node, but it will appear before it, even though it will be numbered sequentially. And what I'm going to call this node will be cross-process, which is a very specific type of look. It refers to a type of film development method, and it produces a very retro type of look because it forces you to bring in opposing colors into opposite tonal ranges of the image. So I can show you what this looks like. It's really interesting. The only thing you really have to do is isolate one of your color channels on the curves, and again, either create an S-curve or reverse S. So with the red channel, I could, for example, increase cyan in the shadows and then push red into the highlights. And you see it's immediately got a very distinct look. If you are trying to use this in creative projects, you might want to be really subtle with it, because I think it does pack a punch even when you're using it very minutely. But of course, it looks much more dramatic for demonstration purposes if you push them in very far areas. So I'm going to switch to the blue channel, and I'll do a reverse S-curve for this. So I want to push blue into my shadows, push yellow into the highlights and the upper midtones, and then counteract some of that if I feel that the shadows are too strong. Cool. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So I can look at my full image. So it's Command F on your keyboard, by the way, if you want to expand that to your full monitor. And you can still use the same shortcuts for bypassing your node. So I can press Command D, and I can just bypass the look, and I can assess, compared to the original data, do I like this look? And I think, yeah, this kind of works, it's cool. I can also use another shortcut, which is Shift D, and that will bypass the entire node pipeline, which includes that balancing that we did and the contrast and the look. And that just brings us back to the original media that we were working on. So sometimes that's also helpful for review purposes. I'm then going to press Command F to exit full screen mode and keep working on this. So we've created a couple of looks now. Let's save these just so we can keep track of them, and also so we can reuse them at a later time if we need to. I'm going to save this first one by right-clicking in the viewer, and I'm going to select Grab Still at the very top. Right. As soon as I did that, the still has appeared in my gallery. So it's got a thumbnail that represents the exact frame that I was on when I grabbed it. Underneath that, the conventional naming method is that the first number represents the video track that the clip is on. The second number represents the order of the clip in the edit. And then the third one is the version of the still that you've grabbed. So in this case, we're on video track 1. This is the second clip on the timeline, as we saw. And this is the first time that I've grabbed a still from it. So that means that you can then, start designing new looks and start grabbing new stills, and they will be named accordingly, 122, 123. You can also double click just underneath those numbers to enter a custom name, which I think makes a lot of sense because not only can you be more descriptive, but you can also remind yourself of what the purpose of the still is. Not all of them are for retaining your looks, right? Some of them will be there for matching and grading purposes, which is what we'll look at later on. But I'm going to give it a name. I created a very distinct cross-process look, so that's how I'm going to save it. And I'm also going to navigate back to the first clip that I have with the rhino and do the same thing. I'm going to right-click, grab still. That one's called 111, of course. And if double-clicking underneath those numbers doesn't work for you, you can always just right-click on the still itself and change the label, and that will give you the same controls. And this time we went for like a blue look on this image, so that's what I'm going to call it. And you know what, since we're here in the gallery, and I am very particular about housekeeping, as I've said, we're also going to organize these stills. So right now they're just sort of floating out there in the gallery. I'd rather create a dedicated album that we can just file them away into. To access our list of albums, I'm going to click on the sidebar icon in the top left corner of the gallery. And by default, these are the albums you're going to see. Stills 1 is where everything ends up. Power Grade 1, which is essentially an album that shares your grades with other projects on your workstation, which is really cool. And then Timelines, which gives you access to all the timelines that you have in any given project that you're working on. So in this case, I'm going to right-click in that sidebar, add a new Stills album, and I can just double-click to name it something else. This will be where I keep all of my looks, so that's what I'll call it. Then I can go back to Stills 1, which is where these ended up, and I'm going to just press Shift to select both of these and then drag and drop them into that looks album. All right, cool. The next thing I'd like to start taking a look at is matching clips to each other. So this is another very vital process in color grading, in primary grading. Just now we've been working on these clips individually, making sure that they're normalized, that the colors are all accurate and balanced. But equally important is matching clips to each other, so referring to other media on the same timeline and asking yourself, does it all flow? The idea, of course, is that you want everything in your project to look like it was happening in real time. So if the colors start shifting a little bit, then it's going to be obvious that this was shot over the course of a day or several days. In this case, for example, we have these 3 clips captured for a documentary on aviation. And I'm going to disable looping in my viewer and then just press play to watch all 3 of them backwards. So notice how none of them really match, right? The first one starts off, it's quite warm and quite dark compared to the one that follows it, which is really bright and pretty neutral as well, followed by another one that's way too dark and a bit colder. So they're all in completely opposite directions. And this happens a lot with documentary recording. So usually the DPs don't have as much control of the environment. So they can't really set up the light sources as often if they're shooting outdoors. Oftentimes they're jumping from indoor recording to outdoor. Wedding videographers experience this a lot, so it's important to be able to match everything, make sure it flows well. I think this central clip is a really good neutral clip, so I'll use this as my basis. And for the first set of exercises, I'm going to use the auto match tool on the color page. So I'm going to select the clip that I want to change. And I'm going to right-click the clip that I want to match it to, and that will be clip number 5. And I will, from the contextual menu, select Shot Match to this clip. And did you see that? So it's a pretty strong change in color, once again, I can press Command D. You can see that's the original, and that's how much the colors have shifted. If you look at any shared elements that they have in terms of like content, so they're both on the tarmac. These are both planes. They've got fuselages. You can see that both of those elements match up so much more closely now, which is great. I can also do the same thing with the next clip. So once again, select the clip that you want to impact, but then right-click the clip that you want to borrow the grade from. So shot match to this clip. And once again, another successful adjustment. It's brightened up the image, and we no longer have as much of a cold cast. So now I can switch between these, and I can also play through. And now as B-roll, it just feels much more natural. It flows through. All right. However, this has been particularly successful because of the many shared elements that these clips have, and essentially the reliable white points and black points that they have. Oftentimes when you're working with media, you're not going to have these types of reliable points, which makes it more difficult to use auto matching, which is sort of a mechanical process. So it's super important to also be able to match things manually using the scopes, the grading tools, and our eyes. So we're going to do this for these two clips on the timeline. So these are also from a documentary. And you can see captured at different times of the day. The first clip is very cold, and the next clip is a bit more neutral, much warmer as well. So it doesn't really matter which one I match to which. It kind of depends on where my final grade is going. In this case, I want to match clip number 8, this one, to the one directly after it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a still of clip number 9 as a reference. So if I grab it right now, it's going to end up in my looks album, and I don't want that. So I'll click on stills 1, and then I'm going to right click in the viewer and going to select grab still again. And this time I'm going to double click and type in the word reference. And that way, if I'm starting to clear out my gallery at a later stage, I'm not going to be paranoid about, am I deleting an important grade that I created earlier that I need to hang on to? No, it's just a reference. I can get rid of it. Cool. I can now go back to clip number 8. And if I was to double click that reference still right now, it will appear in the viewer side by side, so it's actually being wiped right now. And then a couple of things have changed in the viewer itself. So in the top left corner, I can see that image wipe has been activated. This is also where you will be deactivating it as well. So if you just click the icon, it goes away. On top of that, you have full control over the wipe line in the center. So if you find that there's something you need to see that you can't, you can always just reveal it that way, make room for yourself. And then finally, you also have access to different wipe modes. So depending on the content of your video, you might find that a vertical wipe is preferable to a horizontal because it might reveal, certain shared elements, and that's perfectly fine. All right, I'm going to go back to a horizontal one. And what I also really like about the behavior of the wipe tool is that the scopes also get wiped. So I can actually see a live readout of how the channels are different from each other, and that's going to make it so easy for me to match them to one another, because matching, unlike balancing, is not about getting all 3 parades to look the same in grayscale areas. It's actually about getting the relationship between the channels to be the same. So if on one image the red channel is far more dominant than the blue, then if I'm performing matching, I have to kind of replicate that mismatch between the parades. So in this case, if I was to zoom in right now, you can see there's a few different cutoffs. The red, for example, is a little bit too low along that wipe line. You can see that the parade on the left-hand side is just all dipped a little bit. And then even more so on the blue, you can see there's a really big spike at the top here. So that means that the image in the midtones and the upper midtones has got a lot more blue in it. And when I look back at the image, that makes perfect sense, right? This is a much, much cooler image than the one on the right. So for this, I am going to use the curves. I'm going to select this first node, and I'm just going to preemptively label it so I know what it's doing. I'm going to right-click, node label, and call it match. And then without even going after the luminance curve, I'm just going to directly activate R. And I'm going to click on the white point of that curve and drag it upwards. And you can see, if I zoom into the parades right now, that I'm just very gently raising that left parade to match the height of the one on the right. And it's a very small adjustment. I don't have to be too extreme. Then I can do the same exact thing for the blue channel. So I'll click on B to isolate the blue, and I'm just going to lower that white point until the height matches. Notice how I'm not looking at the viewer right now. It really doesn't matter if I'm relying on the scopes. Then if I do everything right, then the viewer should just catch up and show the right thing when I'm done. What else? If I'm looking at the shadows, which I also have to match, I'll zoom out and take a look at what's happening. So yes, definitely looking a lot better. So that dry grass is starting to match up. When I see those dips in the traces, those are the darkest parts of the image. And on the left-hand side, that will refer to the man's hair and to the wrinkles in his clothes and also the dog's face. On the right-hand side, that will most likely refer to the horse's mane. So I think that it's reasonable to get those elements to match in terms of contrast and in terms of color. And I can see that the blue, I think, is substantially higher than it needs to be. So I'll also go for the blue-black point and drag that down just a little bit. So a very small adjustment. And then drag the blue back up again, so reiterate it if I have to. And then finally, it feels like there is just a little bit of like a green dominance in the image, so I'm also going to isolate the green channel and drag that down ever so slightly to counteract that. And there we go. I think safe to say that's a pretty good starting point considering we only spent about a minute on it. I can increase my white mode so that it fills up pretty much the entire viewer, and also press Command W to switch between them like that. And I can also, so let me just actually lower that green just a touch. I can also just deactivate my white mode and use the up and down arrow keys on my keyboard to jump between the clips on the timeline as well. So these are now matched up. The great thing about matching your media is that when you then start to perform creative grading, you can copy those grades across clips, and they will continue to look consistent, right? And that's really the most important reason for matching. If you had a certain look that you had designed, and you then copied it across to a whole bunch of media that wasn't matched, their differences would just be further accentuated. They definitely would not, continue to look the same with the same grade applied. So let's test this out. I'm going to create a new serial node. This time I'm going to use a shortcut. So I'm going to press Alt-S, and I'm going to right-click, select Node Label, call this Contrast. Awesome. And for that, I am just going to use the color wheels adjustment controls. So that will be increasing the contrast. And then also use the pivot to maybe brighten up the overall image. All right, so it's a pretty nice look. Command D to show it before the contrast, and then Shift D to look at it before the grade and the contrast. I can now just use standard copy and paste shortcuts to copy that contrast onto clip number 9. So I can press Command C, Command V. However, you also have access to these types of controls in the Edit menu on the interface. So Edit, and then you have Copy and Paste as well. So I can click on clip number 9. And just for the sake of consistency, I'm going to create a new node, even though I haven't applied a grade to node number 1. So that will be Alt-S to create a new serial, and Command V to paste it. And that's our contrast. And now when I click back and forth, their relationship has been maintained because of that match node. So that's why it's really important. It's really fun to work with. All right. So now that we've looked at the grading tools and we've looked at a few different techniques, I'd like to come back and talk a little bit more about organization. And this time, I want to talk about applying flags to clips to identify certain features that you want to keep track of. So flags work fantastically with this filter option at the top of the color page called Clips. Well, it's located in the Clips button. When you click on the drop-down arrow next to it, you reveal all the different filter options that you have access to. These are pretty straightforward. I really like this one called Graded Clips. So if I was to select that right now, I can review what I've graded, but then I can also look at the inverse of that, ungraded clips, which then reminds you of, oh, by the way, you may have accidentally, skipped these when you were grading, and that will, be important to check out before you render out your video. So that's one thing. But I'm also really, I'm prone to using this with flags because if I'm working with a lot of media, I might start to identify certain needs that certain clips have that I would rather approach like in one fell swoop, as a batch, as opposed to jumping up and down the timeline trying to find certain clips. So I'll give you a few examples. I would like to continue working on clips 2 and 3 today to perform some secondary grading. So I'm going to mark them with a yellow flag. I can right-click on any one of these and select Flags and Yellow. Just brings it up in the top left corner. Another way to apply flags is to use the shortcut G. However, the color of the flag that appears will reflect the color that the flags are set to on your edit page. So if you want to change that behavior, just change it over here. But another thing I could do if I've already applied a flag and I want to change the color is just to double click it. And that will bring up its own little flags interface. Here I can change the color to yellow. And I can even add a note, which is super useful. So in this case, I know that what I want to do in this clip is to change that water blue. And I'll click Done. And notice that a black dot has appeared in the center of the flag, and that's an indication that there is some sort of note associated with it. So that's pretty good. I would like to also apply a couple more flags. So clips 7 and 10 I'm going to be using later on for demonstrating open effects. So I'm going to press 7. I'm going to hold Command and press clip 10 as well. So you can apply flags to multiple clips as well. It's not just one by one. I'm going to right-click, select Flags, and this time I do want a blue flag, and now it's appeared on both of those clips. Cool. So yeah, let's start looking at some secondary grading. I'm going to filter my timeline based on these flags. So I'll go over here, flagged clips, select yellow, and immediately all other clips have disappeared, just those 2 yellow ones have come back. I'm also going to filter it by blue flags, so that's just going to append those 2 as well, based on the order of the clips on the timeline, of course. Something that I use this for a lot is when I'm working on projects that have green screen materials, so like a music video, because I don't want to be jumping up and down and doing chroma key work like that. I'd rather just put green flags on all the green screen clips and then just filter it, and then for the rest of the afternoon I'm focused on compositing and nothing else. So it's quite handy. With these clips, what I'd like to do with the first one is continue refining the face of this scale. So I like the look that I've created, I like the level of contrast that I have, but I feel it's just not punchy enough. It's still a little bit flat, a little bit boring. So what I'm going to do is use a window to select the face of that scale and just pop it out a bit more. So by the way, I've used that term, secondary grading. I haven't really described what it does. Secondary grading, as opposed to primary, which affects the entire frame of the image, impacts only a portion of the image. And this is done primarily by 2 means. You can either perform a key, so in this case you're using the qualifier on the color page of DaVinci Resolve, to impact a specific color or a specific luminance range. And the second way that you perform secondary grading is by using masks. So this will be vector shapes, or even custom shapes that you create with a pen, or in this case, what's it called? A custom curve tool. Yeah. And you can then track to the footage or even keyframe and animate and rotoscope. So we'll be looking at both of these in a second. For this one, I am going to first create a brand new node. When it comes to secondary color grading, you usually want to apply these after the normalization and the balance, but perhaps before you start applying creative grades and harsh contrast. So what I'm going to do is just move these two aside a little bit, select my balance, and add a new serial node. There we go. And I'm going to change the label, call this scales, because that's what I'm impacting. And I'm going to, for the first time, launch the window palette in the central palettes. And it's a pretty easy window to navigate. All along the center here, you have a series of window presets. So these are mostly like standard shapes like squares and circles, but you've also got customization options. And then at the top, you also have a line of additional presets, preset buttons. So in case you wanted to use 2 circles, then you would activate the one that comes already in the palette and then create a second one at the top. On the right-hand side, you have all of the controls that you're going to need to position and scale up the window. But you will also have on-screen controls, which you're about to see in a second. So I am going to click on that circle window and bring it up in the viewer. So now I can pick it up and reposition it. I can drag the corners. I think these types of transform controls are pretty intuitive to use on viewers. Something else I might want to do is collapse my clip's timeline so that I can see this much better. And I can also scroll out of the viewer a little bit so I can see beyond the boundaries and adjust that circle a little finer. Finally, because these scales are not directly to camera, so they're not perfectly round, they're at an angle, I might want to transform this circle into a Bezier shape. And what that's going to do is just break up the constraints of the circle and allow me to navigate the points individually. So I'm going to convert to Bezier, and I can now pick these up one by one and reposition them to the edges. I can also drag the handles on the Bezier points to refine the severity of the angle of that selection, so I can make sure that it follows the curve of that tilted circle. All right. And if I want to see a preview of what that selection looks like in the viewer, I can click on the highlight tool in the top left corner. So this is pretty close to that white mode clip button that we had. And we now have a representation of our selection against a gray background. So that gives us a pretty good overview of what we've just done. I can see that the edge on this is pretty harsh, so I'll probably want to go here into my softness controls in the window palette and just drag that value upwards a little bit to make it just a little gentler. Usually if you're selecting something that's organic, like people's faces, you're following something around, then you can be quite aggressive with the softness, so you want to just blend it in quite evenly into the shot. But with something as geometric as this, you can keep it pretty minor, and then disable the highlight mode when you're done with your selection and refining it. So what do I want to actually do with these scales? So far, we haven't really done anything. Secondary tools like the window and the qualifier don't actually make any changes to your image at all. For that, you have to go back to your standard color grading tools and perform the changes. So I'm going to go to the color wheels, back to the master curves, and I'll drag the gamma to the right to brighten up those scales. That looks really nice. They're just popping out like that. I'm also going to increase the contrast and the pivot even more. And once again, just return to that mid-tone detail because I've got so much fine information here and I just want to pop that out. Cool. I'm going to press Command D, and that's pretty big change. And you know, if this was the focus of the shot, if I really wanted the audience to pay attention to what they were looking at, you know, this would be such, you know, a great way to direct the eye. Since I'm here, I may as well apply another form of window secondary grading. This time I'm going to add a vignette, which is classically like a shadow that falls on the lens from the matte box of the camera. But now with digital grading, it's used for aesthetic purposes, and it adds a sort of frame to the image by darkening the edges. So that makes sense to add at the very end of the workflow, because you definitely don't want any of your color grading affecting the vignette. So I'm going to press Alt-S to create a new one. So when it starts running out of room in the node editor, it's going to start placing it on a second line. And there's a few ways you can work around that. You can, for example, collapse a panel that you're not using and give the node editor more room. Something else you could do is also just rescale the size of those thumbnails and just zoom out a bit, and they're more likely to end up on one line. So I'll select that last one, and that will be my vignette. Cool. And I'll return to my window palette. Once again, I'm going to activate the circle. And you know what, this time I'm also going to name it, because I didn't name the previous ones. So all you have to do is just double-click the empty space next to the circle window icon, and that brings up a field. So I can type in vignette, which is its purpose. And now I'm just going to drag the edges, extend them to the viewer. And I can also drag the red points around the circle, which controls the softness. So just make sure that the edge is not harsh. Now, if I was to go into the color wheels and start darkening the edges the way I want to, something really strange is going to start happening, right? The inside of the image is actually getting darker, which is the opposite of what I want. So I'm going to reset the gamma wheel, and I'm going to click on the highlight mode in the viewer to see what's actually happening. Right. So it's important to remember that all of the windows are additive by default. Whenever you make a selection, you're actually targeting whatever's on the inside of the window. If you want to change that behavior, you can do so by using a couple of icons here next to the window name. So you've got the invert and mask controls, and you can use them in combination with other windows, so you can actually start to intersect selections or subtract selections from others, which is quite handy. In this case, all I want to do is invert the selection, so that will be the option on the left. And you can see now that's inverted it, and I'm now focusing on the edges of the screen. I can disable my highlight mode and do the same thing with the gamma. Again, the reason I'm using gamma is because I don't want to darken the white point and the black point, because that will be far more evident, especially in somewhere like the window. But if I go for the gamma ranges, it's going to target the walls first, and that always tends to look a bit more realistic. Also, while I'm working on this, I can go back to the softness controls in the window palette, make sure that the edges are not super obvious. And another tip is that if you go back to the clip's timeline, keep an eye on the thumbnail. A good rule of thumb is that if you can start to see the vignette in the thumbnail, that's usually an indication that the vignette might be a little too harsh, and it's going to be really obvious on a bigger screen. So I think mine is starting to look very obvious, so I'm just going to drag that back a little bit. All right, so it's almost to the point where you think it's not even there anymore, but again, press Command-D to compare it to what it was before the vignette. And you can see that there is this little adjustment. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. Just before I move on, I'm going to save this window as a preset. I've used vignettes quite a lot, so what I'm going to do is just go back here to the window palette, click on my options menu, and at the top I have save as new preset. So I'll select that. It prompts me to give it a name, and I think that's an obvious one, vignette. Click OK. And now, next time I'm on a clip and I activate a circle window, when I click on the options menu, I will see this preset at the top of the list. So I can just click on that and it will automatically rescale it, resize it to the viewer, but it will not make any changes to the color wheels. So that's still entirely in your control. It's just about reshaping and resizing that window position. This is pretty handy also if you're working on a documentary and you've got a lot of interviews, for example, and maybe The way that the people were framed and positioned were more or less the same from one interview to the next. You can just make something that's like specific, like the interview vignette, you know, and save that as a preset window and keep reusing that. All right, let's take a look at the second form of secondary grading on the color page, which is using the qualifier. So you'll find the qualifier right next to the window palette. And right now, it's just giving us a broad selection of all the ranges. Once we start indicating what we want to key, then those ranges will contract to those selections. So let's do that. I am going to click and drag across the image. And I just realized I'm doing this on the balance node. I'm glad I made this mistake because I can explain why that was a bad idea. So right now, I'm completely extracting all of the data from the balance node. I'm going to press Command-Z to reset my qualifier. There it is. And I'm going to make a dedicated node. That'll be a much better idea. So that's Option S. And I will also label it. I know that the task that we were given, that we wrote down on our flag, was to turn this water blue. So I'm going to enable looping in the viewer, and I'm going to play back this clip. And I think changing the water to blue will be relatively easy because this water is almost the color of green screen, you know, so it should be relatively straightforward to key out. But we do have to be really careful with all of these elements that appear in the second half of the shot. So you've got this really vibrant yellow airplane, you've got these flamingos in the background. So I'm going to keep them in mind, make sure we're not being destructive. I am going to make sure I'm on this part of the viewer when I'm making my selection, because a big part of keying is making sure that the extraction is clean around the edges, and I will not be able to tell how clean it is on the first frame of the clip. So it's not as useful to me. I'll drag it to the end, right over here. And I could just click to define a range in the qualifier, but by clicking and dragging, I'm actually recording like a multitude of ranges. So if you look down at the qualifier palette, you can see that the little ranges are just kind of expanding the more I drag. Cool. So now that I've made my selection, the ranges are defined. I need to see what that looks like in the highlight mode. You can already see the result of the selection, by the way, in the nodes, the node editor. But of course, I would like a much clearer representation of this. So I'll enable highlight mode. I can also collapse my clip's timeline so I can see this even bigger. That's great. So it's not a bad first selection, but I do need to clean this up. I can see a bit of noise in here. One thing I can do is just grab the edges of that hue selection and whiten it, and you can see that it starts to grab a wider range of colors. So I think the airplane reflection was not being grabbed very well. I'm going to be quite careful with this because I don't want to grab, you know, a really strong key at the expense of like some of the other elements in the shot. But so far that looks all right. I think maybe there's nothing else that jumps out at me. Maybe also grab things of a lower saturation. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. Once I'm done refining the ranges over here, the hue, saturation, and luminance, which is where the name of the qualifier gets its name, I'm going to switch to a matte representation of this selection. So this is the black and white highlight. And this gives me a much clearer representation, so I'm no longer looking at, you know, these green and gray colors. And if I still had any noise left over, this would stand out in a really big way. I think I have a little bit over here. But to clean this up, I'm now going to go to the right side of the qualifier palette, which is the matte finesse. So this is almost like stage 2 of refining your key. Whereas on the left-hand side, you were refining it based on the image content and the RGB data. On the right-hand side, you're refining it based on the actual matte, right, the black and white image itself. So I am going to click on the denoise field and drag it, and I can see that a lot of the dots have just disappeared. Cool. And then clean black and clean white are almost like contrast adjustments. They will just, increase white in areas where it's not as strong as in others. And that got rid of the rest of the noise that I had over here. So I'm really happy, really small adjustments as well. I might want to blur this just a touch, just to make sure that I'm not seeing any like pixelation around the edges of my selection. I mentioned earlier that grading is a reiterative process. Same thing with key selection. You can always go back to this tool and refine your selection once you start performing the actual grade. So sometimes it's not always clear how the key tools, the grading tools will interact with the selection. I'm going to hide my highlight mode and apply a grade to this. So I'm going to decide which tool I want to use. I could use the color wheels if I wanted to. I could, for example, use the hue rotation in the adjustments. So that's not a bad option. Something that I think might work well as well is the blue channel. So I could grab the black point of that blue channel and just raise it up, up, up. And that will change the color pretty uniformly, which I'm very happy with. And then I can go back to the color wheels and maybe use hue rotation to change like the warmth of that blue, so I can make it a bit more cyan. And also change the brightness of the water using the gamma wheels. All right. Now I've performed changes to the water, but I might also want to continue working on the elements outside of that water. So in this case, I'd also like to grade the airplane. I could, make a new serial node, I could make another selection, and I could invert it, because I've already showed you that inverting is possible with Windows, and it is also possible with the qualifier. You have an icon over here. But generally, the rule with node-based grading and compositing is that you never have to do anything twice. So if I've already performed this key, I should be able to just reuse this key data and reuse it, invert it after the fact. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to right-click. And what I could do is add a new serial node and just connect the key between the two. But there's actually a single node that will perform both actions in one go. So I'm going to click on Add Outside Node. And we're suddenly seeing this structure for the first time. The RGB pipeline that we've seen before is still running through all the nodes and reaching the output, which is what we're seeing in the viewer. But now there's this new mini pipeline running between the key output of the blue water into the key input of node number 3, which I'm also going to label outside. And by default, when you have this kind of connection, it will automatically invert the key that you had. I could disable this behavior and I can re-invert it so that I can keep working on the water if I wanted to. But in this case, I do actually want to work on the plane. So maybe what I want to do is fix how vibrant it is. Like, it almost looks artificial against this blue water, which I toned down a bit. So what I'm going to do is maybe go back to my curves, connect all of my channels, and I'm just going to lower both the white and the black point, almost like to darken it a little bit. And I'm bringing back a little bit more detail in the shadows of the airplane, so it's not as overexposed anymore. So if I press Command D, you can see it's brought back a lot of information. Maybe another thing I could do is just drag the offset towards yellow so that it's also still quite vibrant. All right, maybe raise the gamma. Cool. One thing that I'm not crazy about is that I think that there is a pretty solid outline around the airplane in the image. And like I said, you can continue to work on your qualifier tool and the matte finesse after the fact. So I can now go back to blue water and select my qualifier palette, and then use the in and out ratio to either expand or contract that matte that I have. So I'm going to click in and out ratio, and pretty much clean up that outline by dragging it to the left. If I drag it to the right, then I'm going to end up expanding it, and you can see there's like a red tinge around it now because it's being affected by the hue rotation. So I'm going to reset and drag it inwards. All right, and that's pretty good. Cool. Something that's also a bit of an issue when I disable this node and bring it back in is what's happening to the flamingos in the background. So they're obviously being graded as well. And that makes sense, right? Because when we were making the selection of the water, we were just focusing on the blue of the water. So when we inverted that selection and started working on it in the outside node, anything that we, any grades that we apply are also going to apply to the birds. So that's the next thing I'd like to do, is to draw a window around that airplane to isolate that extraction to just that area. And that's what makes secondary grading so versatile, is that you can combine so many different tools. And combining the qualifier with the windows is just one of the best ways to refine your grade. So I'm going to create a custom curve around that window. I'm going to activate that icon down here, double click to call it airplane. And to start drawing a custom curve, I just have to click and then click. When I just click, I create linear points, but when I click and I drag, I create a Bezier curve. So that allows me to create fewer points, because that means that I can just make circular selections around something. This is particularly helpful with organic selections, like when you're trying to rotoscope people. And then to turn this into an actual shape, I have to click on the first point that I made last. That closes the loop of the path and it generates a shape. Great, and now it's also given me some on-screen controls, so you can see that I've now got this rotation arrow that I can take advantage of. But then I've also got the transform controls of the window palette itself. Cool. All right, so that feels like it's almost done, except if I was to play this through, of course, this is a moving shot. So we'll also need to track the motion of the airplane. I am going to navigate to the next palette next to the window, the tracker palette. And I'm just going to generate a very basic track. Since we're at the end of the clip, we will need to track in the left direction. So I'm going to click on Analyze or Track Reverse. And the playhead will just dance across. Once the airplane starts leaving the shot, the tracker will stop performing, because obviously there's no more RGB data for it to follow. So I'm going to need to complete the rest of this manually. This is also fairly straightforward to do. I mean, it just took us about 2 seconds to perform the front end of it. That's already finished. I'm going to use these keyframe navigation controls in the tracker graph to jump to the last point that it was able to analyze. And I'm then going to switch from clip mode, which applies changes to the window on a clip-long basis, to frame mode, which allows me to essentially perform keyframing. And when I'm in frame mode, I can also jump to the very beginning of this clip. Or actually, you know what? I'm just going to pick up the playhead and drag it across until the plane leaves the shot, like there. So it's not really the very beginning. And I can center click my mouse so I can drag to the top of the viewer, pick up the window, and then just drag it off like that. And because we're now performing manual keyframing, the data between the preceding keyframe and the current one is just going to be generated for us based on the amount of movement the window has performed and the amount of time that occurs between the two of these. So I'm going to drag these and make sure that we're not leaving out the window, and that's great. And then finally, there was also a keyframe at the very start, so I'm going to just jump to that with my navigator and drag the window off for that as well. So that's great. And now if I was to check out the matte data, the airplane is on its own. If I was to deselect that outside node, you will see that it reveals the birds again. Cool. So I'm going to turn off highlight and return to my clips timeline. All right, so I've been talking a lot about the node editor. I've been talking about the integrity of the RGB signal and also pointing at the nodes, but I haven't expressly talked about this workflow. So what I'd like to do is construct a few very basic grades, really to show you the principles of how the RGB signal is treated on this pipeline. So the first thing I'd like to do is just talk about the node anatomy. First of all, You have a single starting node with every clip that you select. It's completely ungraded. And it's stranded on this single pipeline that runs from the RGB source on the left-hand side. This represents your source media, essentially. This is what the RGB values are when it enters. If you're working with raw media, this will be the stage at which it is debayered. So debayering happens before that. And again, you're now working with RGB pixels at this stage. It enters the RGB input of the corrector node. And here you can start to perform any sorts of changes that you'd like, whether they're color-based, whether they're effects-based using the OpenFX palette. And these changes will impact the waveform of the image, and then that version of the waveform exits, and it travels through all the other nodes, which also transform it in some way until it reaches the final output node. And this is what you see in the viewer, and is also what will end up on the delivered page, what will be rendered out. Underneath the RGB inputs and outputs are the keys, which I mentioned earlier. So these do not carry any RGB data. These purely work on the basis of a black and white guide layer that will notify the RGB pixels where they should be visible and where invisible. So white in this case is full opacity, black is full transparency. And then grayscale also qualifies as semi-transparency. You saw earlier that we can share key data and that we can send them out. Same thing for the RGB data. You can actually send out a signal to multiple nodes at once. Like I said, you don't need to do anything twice in a node-based structure if you don't want to, or if you don't have to. So with certain node structures, we have layer mixers, we have parallel mixers. They're types of nodes that are capable of taking multiple inputs. So then you can send a normalized version of the image, and you can blend it with something that was maybe graded with a look. Or you can oftentimes blend things that have secondary grading on them. But there is a dedicated video for that, so check it out. In this case, we're just going to be looking at this linear pipeline. And the first demonstration I want to show you, it might seem really obvious, but it's kind of important to check it out just to verify that you've understood the nature of the signal treatment. So the first thing I'm going to do to this image is turn it black and white. The simplest way I can do this is by going to the bottom of the color wheels and just setting my saturation to 0. Because of course, when there's no color saturation, the image turns grayscale. But I think we can do something a little bit more interesting. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. And I'm actually going to use a different palette for this. Right next to the color wheels, we have this palette called the RGB Mixer. And what this usually does is it allows you to change the balance of the primary colors in the RGB signal. At the very bottom of this palette, you have a monochrome option, which will turn your image black and white. And then you can continue to adjust the individual channel outputs to control their strength in the black and white image, which I think is really interesting, gives you a lot of control creatively. So in his case, because we started off with an image that was very kind of beigey, very muted in tones, he's kind of like blending into it too much. And what I can do is increase the red output to make him stand out just a little bit against that wall. He is wearing a blue shirt, I believe, so using the blue output could either brighten or darken his shirt, but of course that's affecting his skin because that's affecting the amount of yellow information, which is the opposite of the blue channel. So these are pretty fun to play with, especially when you're working on videos with like organic elements like trees and skies, because obviously like green and blue will impact those quite a lot. All right, so I've made this black and white node. I am going to label it accordingly. And then I'm going to create a new node that's then working with this black and white version of the signal. So Alt-S. And I'm going to label this one sepia. And you might be familiar with the term sepia refers to like a reddish, brownish tint. It's usually associated with old photography. Since we've got a black and white image, it's perfect for this because all I have to do is just grab the offset color wheel and push it towards like an orangey red range. And that's it. So that makes perfect sense, right, in terms of what's happening on the signal. turning the image black and white and then adding a single color to make a monochromatic effect. However, what will happen if I was to switch the order of these two nodes? All right, think about what's going to happen to the signal and what we're going to see visually in the viewer. All right, so I'll perform that change right now. One way to switch nodes around is just by extracting one of them. So I will press the E shortcut for extract, and that popped out the sepia. I can now move my black and white node across, pick up the sepia node, and then when the pipeline lights up like this, it means that I'm ready to drop it off and reconnect it. And when I reconnect it, hopefully that result was predictable to you. The image turned black and white because that's the very last thing to impact the signal before it reached the output of this pipeline. But something else that should be noted is that the sepia node still has a function. So it's not completely useless just because it's being overwritten by the black and white. Remember, we increased the amount of orange and red in the image at this stage, which means that it is now impacting the way that the RGB mixer is revealing this information. If I was to go back here and disable my sepia node with Command D, that actually impacts the image as well. So everything matters in this case. I'm going to reset my pipeline and show you another example. So I'm going to right-click, and in the contextual menu, just in the general area of the node editor, I'm going to set reset all grades and nodes. That's great. And this time, I want to talk about destructive workflows. So it's something that's very easy to fall into, and I want to show you a few ways that you can avoid them. For this example, I'm going to first go into my color wheels. And what I'd like to do is just grab the master wheel of the lift and absolutely crush those shadows. So I'm dragging it to the left. Far darker than anything you would ever do in a grade, but I'm doing this to demonstrate something. So you can see that the shadows are completely gone. Down here in the scopes, they're all crushed under that black point line. All the detail in his shirt is gone, so I'll remind you, Command D, that this is what it looked like a second ago. And I'm going to label it accordingly. Lift is what I adjusted. I'm going to make a new serial node, Option S, and I'll be honest with you, I am using a shortcut for labeling at this point, but it's a shortcut that I had to make myself. So actually, I'm going to show it off because this is a new feature with the latest release. But here in DaVinci Resolve, you have your keyboard customization options. And what I did was I just did a search for the label in all commands. And here it revealed that on the color page inside of nodes, I have the label selected node command. And what I like to set it to is the tab key. So it's a very prominent key on your keyboard. It's next to the letter Q. I use it all the time when I'm jumping between windows. And it's not really assigned to anything on the software by default. So that's my little spiel. That's the Daria shortcut. So I am going to press tab. And I'm going to try to restore these shadows, this time using the curves. But do you think that can be done? So image is completely crushed. And let me try this. I'm going to open up the curves palette. I'm going to click in the center of the curve, and I'm going to try to drag this upwards to try to restore this data. And this feels like a very strong no way. Like this feels like permanently damaged video. In fact, I'm clearly making it worse. I'm increasing contrast, I'm overexposing the areas that we can see, and that data at the bottom of the scopes seems to be permanently stuck there. So to a much lesser degree, this is something that a lot of colorists find themselves doing, adjusting their shadows or their contrast too early on in the process, not to this degree, but like to a much smaller degree, and then trying to bring some of it back at a later stage and finding that the adjustment is just too aggressive, and they're starting to see noise and pixelation and banding, and it's not great. So the good news is that technically, it's not a destructive workflow until you start using the tools incorrectly. So when I reset this, I can still restore the data. It's a digital signal, so nothing is actually getting lost or destroyed. The only thing is that I was targeting the wrong range. when you grab the middle of the curves, you're actually adjusting the gamma of the image. And we know that we made the adjustment in this node using the lift master wheel. So the lift is the black point on the curve. I'm going to go back to this curves node, pick up that black point, and knowing that it used to be negative 25, I just have to raise it by a factor of about a quarter, and I should, in theory, be able to bring back all of this information and keep grading the way I started out. So yes, the workflow is not destructive, but if you're not careful, it could very quickly become that way. I am going to reset this once again. So right-click, reset all grades and nodes. And then I'm going to show you a final example, and this will probably be the most subtle of the three, but it kind of follows the natural progression of what I've been demonstrating so far. So it will combine kind of both techniques. I will start off just by creating a bit of a contrast to this image, so something quite gentle. So I'm going to make sure his face is not overexposed, but it's just popping out a bit more. All right. And then I'm going to press Alt-S to make a new node, and this is where I'm going to apply a look. So I'll call this the blue look. And I'm going to make it super simple. I'm going to grab the gamma color wheel, push it towards blue. About this much. And the next question I want to ask is, again, will it make much of a difference if I drag the positions of these two nodes around? Let me perform that switch. So previously I used extract, or the shortcut E, but another way I can do this is just by selecting and clicking the node, holding the command key on my keyboard, and then just dragging it across to a different node, and that will switch their positions. So you can see the blue look appears first now, followed by contrast. And did you see the switch in the viewer? Right, that was a pretty big change. So I'm going to Command Z to undo that to show you what it looked like previously, and then Command Shift Z, yes, to go forward again. So there is a really mild switch between the two. And to answer why this is happening, why there's such a big impact, even though we made such small adjustments, again, it all comes down to the trace and what it looked like at the point in which it was being creatively graded. So right now with the blue look in front, it's actually impacting the version of the trace in which there is no contrast, right? Because we're adding this last. I may as well turn this node off, bypass it, to see the original parade, and that's what the blue look is being applied to. So we've dragged the gamma, which I know is the central part of the image. So in this case, it's actually impacting a great deal of it, after which we are applying a contrast and pushing the two further apart with that blue look baked in. However, if I was to switch these two around, so again, I'm holding the command key and dragging them apart, the shadows look a little bit more neutral. And the reason why that is happening is because now the blue look is being applied to this version of the trace, where the tops and the bottoms of the luminance signal have been pushed further apart. And because the blue look is targeting the gamma range, it's impacting a smaller portion of the image while keeping the shadows and the highlights a bit more neutral, right? They're a bit more separated from that blue look. So I'm not trying to imply that one way is correct and one way is wrong, not at all. What I'm saying is that it's really up to you how you want the grade to look. And you have to keep in mind that where the node is placed has pretty substantial impact on the final look of the image. So yeah, if you see it behaving in a certain way, try to move some nodes around and see what happens. All right, now that we've taken a look at those, I am going to go back to my timeline, and we're just going to look at a few more options that we have on the color page. So I'll click onto this final clip. It's already balanced. It's even got a look on it, so it's got its own little cross process there. So you can see that's the original. And what I'm going to do is apply an effect onto it from our OpenFX palette. I'm going to activate it at the top here, and that will bring up the controls. By default, you're going to see the library of OpenFX. And these are broken up in a multitude of categories, which you can scroll through. You can also double-click the category names to collapse them if you know that there's certain ones that you just are not going to be referring to as often. And there's also a search option at the very top, which allows you to just, well, the whole top of it is blurry. Yeah, allows you to filter what you're seeing. So for the first demonstration, I would like to apply an effect called the Tilt Shift Blur. So type in the word tilt, and then it appears over here. Now I can just pick up the effect and drag it directly onto the pipeline, and that will turn it into a node. But what you could also do is generate a node first and then apply the open effect to that. And the advantage of doing it that way is that you can still use secondary selection methods that way. In this case, I'm happy to leave this the way it is. As soon as you apply an effect to your pipeline, the OpenFX palette will expand to show the settings as well. So you now have these two tabs, Library and Settings. I can collapse my search field at the top. And can I? I guess not. Yeah. There it is, yes. So here I've got the controls for the tilt shift blur, and I can also already see the result of this effect in the viewer. If I was to press Shift F, I will end up expanding my viewer in a way that retains the OpenFX palette, which is really useful because it means that I can see everything at maximum capacity, but then I also have all of these settings that I can keep working on. And some of you might recognize the tilt shift effect. It's meant to mimic using a lens that achieves an artificial depth of field with a sensor that's tilted towards the lens. It's one of those effects. Here we're achieving this artificially. If I was to disable this at the top here, you can see that the top and the bottom of the image are being defocused or blurred. I can also activate the matte representation of this blur by clicking on Depth Map Preview, and that will just show me a black and white image. And using this, I can line up where I want the horizon of this focus to be. So right now, it's actually falling pretty well on those rhinos in the background. And it's covering some of the man, but he's being defocused at the bottom and the top, and I think that's making it look less realistic, because with true shallow depth of field, you can never really achieve that on that plane. So I'm just going to activate that preview and maybe expand, or sorry, relocate the focus sweep a little bit closer to him. It's just a little bit lower. And also expand the in-focus range, so that will just cover a wider range. I can now deactivate that and also impact the amount of blur that I'm seeing in the near blur range in the far. So I don't want to be too intense, but just enough to draw the eye. There we go. And once again, Shift F to get out of this, and I'm all done. Resolve effects can also be combined with secondary tools, like I just said. So I'm going to go back to this shot that I had of this gentleman, and here we're going to obscure his face and protect his identity. It's a little late at this point in the day, but you know, we'll do our best. I'm also going to reset the node pipeline. So I'm going to right-click and reset all grades and nodes. Or actually, wait a second, I want to hang on to that contrast. So I'll just delete the blue look and hang on to this. I'm going to press Alt-S or Option-S on a Mac keyboard. And I'll call this Face Blur. And what I'm going to go for is a mosaic blur, which is kind of like an old school way of obscuring things, and we're going to see some pixelation on a certain part of the image. If I was to just drag and drop this the way it is, can't really work with this image anymore. So I'm going to disable this, and I'm going to use a window to identify what it is that I actually want to apply the mosaic to. So I'll open up the window palette at the bottom. I will activate my circular window and remind myself what I'm using it for again. So that'll be face blur. Reposition it over his face. Excellent. There we go. And then I can bring back the mosaic blur, but the pixels are a little bit too large, so I'm going to have to increase the pixel frequency so that they become a little bit smaller. And I can also further refine my window. I can maybe blur out the edges a bit, make it larger. However, if I was to play this back, I can see that he's moving his head around a little bit, and I don't want to risk losing him. So once again, I'll switch to the tracker palette, and then I'll press track forward, and that will follow him along as he talks. All right, excellent. All right, let's go back to our full timeline before we applied the filter. So I'm going to collapse my OpenFX palette, and over here in the clips, I'm going to select all clips from the top. Cool. I'm also going to open my gallery up again. And remember, we made that looks album a while ago. We've still got our blue look and our cross process from earlier. And I'm going to try to apply one of those grades onto one of the clips in the timeline. So let me go for clip number 4. I think that's a pretty good candidate, right? Because it's a pretty neutral clip. We've already matched it to the other neutral media that we had on clip number 5. There's a couple of very quick ways to apply grades from an existing still or from even a clip on the timeline. You can either right-click and choose Apply Grade. So you can do that on either a still or a clip. Or you can actually use the middle mouse on your button and just click that over the thumbnail, and it will apply it to the media that you have underneath, that you have selected on the timeline. All right, so I've just done that, and what's bizarre is that it looks absolutely, oh, actually, I went for the cross process. There it is, yeah. So it looks absolutely nothing like the cross process that we had. This feels very strongly overexposed, really bright. The shadows are severely blue, whereas here everything's a little bit more muted. So why did this happen? Well, there's a reason for it. When you simply apply a grade, or you use your middle mouse to overwrite it this way, you're actually copying the entire pipeline across and overwriting anything that was there before. Remember, with clips 4 and 6, we had actually performed matching on them to clip number 5, and that match node is now gone. So I'm going to press Command Z to undo and bring back that match node. So if I press Command D, you can see it comes back. I'm also going to label it, so I know it's there. And instead of just overwriting the grade, what I can do is right-click, and I can display the node graph. And that allows me to actually see the individual nodes that make up that entire node pipeline in a separate node editor, and then I can just drag and drop them across onto this pipeline, which I think is great. So I can pick it up, drag it, and this is a much more subtle application, and it's no longer applying the balance that we had on clip number 2, which was very distinct to that clip. It's now using the match that we performed that was specific to this media. So it allows us to break up the workflow a little bit. If you want to export a grade that you've created, either to share with someone else or to save for your own use later on, it's very easy to do from inside the gallery. You can right-click on that thumbnail. I'm just going to disable this behavior right now. It's got live preview on, so I'm just going to turn that off. There we go. Right-click, select Export, and I'm just going to send this to my desktop, to a folder, call it Rhino Grade. And select, oh, got a name. Select Export. And I'm going to go find that file now, just to demonstrate what it looks like when it's been exported out. So I'm going to go back into my desktop. There it is, my Rhino grade. Double click to launch it. And notice how it actually exports out as two separate files, a DPX and a DRX. So these represent the two elements that make up a still. The DPX is that high quality still frame of the image that's been grabbed. You can use it for viewing, you can use it for comparing and matching. The DRX contains all of the metadata that contains the entire grade pipeline. So you need both to be able to import a still into DaVinci Resolve. However, you can use DPX on its own purely for visual references. So I'm going to now do the reverse of that. I'm going to import a grade that I had made earlier. So I will right-click inside the gallery, and in the contextual menu, select Import. There we go. On the desktop, I have my airplane grade, and when I expand that, I also have these two files, but DRX isn't even given to me as an option. So in some systems, you might not even see this DRX at all, but it will piggyback onto the DPX file when you import it. So the grading data will come across. I'm going to select that, click Import, and there it is. We've got the still thumbnail, but I'm now going to select an image. So I think clip number 6. Number 4, yeah, go for clip 6. And I will right-click, and I will apply the grade. And this came with its own normalization stage. You can see that it's broken up. It's got a node that's combining two halves of a grade, and then contrast the vignette at the end. So with Shift-D, I can bypass the entire look, and you can see that the sky has been modified using the qualifier and stuff like that. So pretty nice construction. So I'd like to thank you very much for watching this overview of the color page in DaVinci Resolve. If you have any further questions, or if you would like some tech support, I highly recommend that you visit the Blackmagic forum. It's a pretty active forum, and you can get advice directly from the people who make the software, and also from professional colorists who use it on a day-to-day basis. So you're going to get some pretty solid advice. Also, to see a list of training partners, to check out our certified books and find the additional videos in this series, check out the DaVinci Resolve training page on the website. Thank you very much.